Welcome to the Business End of Agility podcast, hosted by New Zealand's Business Agility Meetup community. We're here to bring you real-world stories from innovative organisations and forward-thinking leaders around the globe. We're going to explore all facets of business agility, from adaptive leadership and evolving company cultures to emerging ways of working, processes and technologies. I'm your host for the session, Bianca, and thank you for joining us. There's one department in every organisation that lives and breathes people. It's the HR department, also known as human resources, although now more commonly known, thankfully, as people and culture. Of course, a name change is not the only thing that's needed in the world of HR. With change occurring even more rapidly with profound people impacts, your HR team is more critical than ever. So in this episode, we'll be chatting with the globetrotting Natal Dank, author, speaker, and consultant in the field of Modernising HR and Agile HR. She'll be sharing her insights into what is going on in HR globally, and what HR functions need to have on their agenda to stay relevant and be able to equip their organizations not just to survive, but thrive in the changes ahead. Welcome to the show, Natal.
It's great to be here, and I'm excited to be known as a globetrotter. not a rather than the pig, an actual an explorer.
It sounds much better. Speaking of which, where are you currently in the world at the moment?
I am currently in Scotland. So this is our UK base. And I always joke that I'm an Australian that lives in Scotland for the weather, because as most people will know, the weather is a little bit suspect in Scotland, but it's very pretty where I live. But I am an Australian that spends a lot of time back in Australia as well as other places for work. Yeah.
I'm quite familiar with dodgy weather. At some point, if the rain gets too loud here, I'll have to put my headphones on and change the mic. Okay, well, I know that you started your career in the financial sector, like myself, but what made you change from numbers to people? What was it that went into that kind of change?
Well, I was much more suited to people rather than numbers. It's interesting. It's one of those ones where, you graduate and you need to earn a buck and you end up in this initial career. And I did study economics, so I've always been very passionate about social sciences, economics, and particularly organizations. But it was at a company called Reuters, which some people would be familiar with. And I made the shift over to essentially kind of training and coaching and facilitation. So I started to train my fellow colleagues on how to do the job. And in particular, it started off with financial markets knowledge, customer service, account management. Then it went into team development, coaching, management development. But it meant that I actually did a lot of that work in business teams, and I actually sat in business teams and even as a consultant for a number of years before I sat in HR. And of course, that initial business focus means that I think I've always applied a very commercial, approach to the world of HR. And I'm, of course, as we're going to talk about modernizing HR, I think that's a key part is understanding how a business runs, understanding how you build products, understanding how you grow a business, understanding how you build the right people strategy that enables your business strategy. And so I think it was an interesting shift, but it was one that was a bit more of a transition based on what I'm better at, rather than anything specifically conscious, which I think a lot of career moves are, aren't they? They're these opportunities that come along as opposed to, yes, I'm going to do this. Yeah.
Organic and emergent.
Yes, definitely.
Speaking of the business and the commercial acumen side, that's one of the things I think I loved about your book most. Was the book is called Agile HR. So you can be forgiven for thinking that it's a little warm and fuzzy, but actually there's a lot of really clear business basis around a lot of the examples and a lot of the approach. So I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, but that certainly comes through in your book. Let's talk about global side of things now. And we mentioned you transitioning between Australia and Scotland, but obviously you work for clients across the world as well. What are you seeing from a trend globally? What's the global trends that are happening right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think what I'll do is I'll reference. So I'm a director and principal consultant for a company called PXO Culture, and we just released our 2025 HR and People Priorities report. And this is looking at the trends, looking at what are some of the other thought leaders and organizations like Gartner and McKinsey's and Deloitte all saying about the world, but also what should HR focus on based on that. And so we took all of
Mm,
that and then put our own kind of twist on there. And this reflects a lot of the conversations I'm having with our clients as well. So there was 5 priorities. The first one is called the productivity crisis. So this is that we're talking about the wrong thing when we constantly debate should we be in the office or out of the office and where do we work best. Actually, it's about getting work done and understanding how a team works effectively.
mm,
So focusing on the work. Do you need deep work? Do you need time when the team comes together? Do you need non-meeting days? So how do you get the work done? And by focusing on that, you'll actually get to the outcome that you need in your organization. So that was one of them. The next one was the ethical emergency, we're calling it. And actually, this has exploded since we wrote about it. So this is looking at topics such as diversity, equity, inclusion,
mm,
climate
right.
change,
Yeah.
and how it had become increasingly problematic on how to keep these agendas moving forward with some of the political changes. And now we're seeing almost an attack on some of those topics from some of the political circles, particularly from Trump America. And it was looking at, well, what again? How does a HR professional navigate that, and particularly a HR leader? And the big call out was you've got to come back to data, you've got to come back to value, you've got to, there's evidence that having a more diverse team, diversity of thought, diversity of background and education
Mm,
leads to better business results. So focus on that and focus on the problem you're solving through those actions. So that one. The next one was called the the HR business partner is now the employee experience account manager. And this is an interesting one. So this is probably the hot topic I'm looking at with lots of clients is as you change your operating model, both in the organization and within HR, you start to work much more multi-skilled. And we're similar to what you're seeing in organizations, we're now talking about the employee experience being the product. So it's a holistic product made of multiple component parts: onboarding, recruitment, reward. But rather than delivering those in silos, we need to work much more together and understand what's the portfolio that sits behind it, what's working, what isn't, what do you kill off, what do you innovate, what do you just keep going because it's working well.
yeah.
And that delivers out across the organization. And there's 2 things. Being a product means you need to deliver value by solving problems. And secondly, it's much more of this holistic approach. You can even take it further and think about the whole product of the organization, then delivering through to the end customer. But what this means is that the business partner needs to shift in their role. They need to become much more the strategist. So they are basically, I call them the account manager. They have to sell the product in to different parts of the business, help value be realized, understand what's needed, and really work with the design teams that are, learning and development, reward, all of these groups around what do they need to design next. But then they need to be the commercial voice. What's going on in the business? What do we need to fix next to deliver value? So very similar to a sales account manager in many ways.
Mm,
So that's one, and that's one that I'm working with a lot of clients on at the moment, upskilling business partners to be much more commercial, strategic, etc. So that's three. And then the next two, one is, of course, we're calling it build, buy, borrow, bot. And this is all about skills. So how do you shift to skills-based talent? How do you identify your gaps? And how do you then build them, borrow them, develop them, or turn them into AI or automation? So that's the bot part.
Mm.
And then the final one, of course, is AI. And this is a really interesting space for HR because, again, there's multi layers. One is how do we use AI to be more effective in what we do, but how do we really help around the ethical questions and governance on how AI comes into organizations? How is it used? How do we use people's data? What is right in terms of, choosing AI over a human in certain situations? How do you know what's going on with the algorithm, and how do you make decisions around it? So yeah, so they are the five, and I think that kind of captures a lot that's going on in the world. So I think that's a
Mm.
nice link to trends.
It's a great call out on that AI as well, because you starting to hear some organizations, more so in the small medium space, that are looking to try and early bank perceived savings around what AI might be able to do, without doing any of those kinds of conversations around the ethical side or the data privacy side, or what it really
Totally.
means strategically for their business.
Yeah. And one thing we talk about is that, first of all, if you're a HR professional, you need to kind of lean in. You need to get familiar with what is AI, how can I use it, what does it look and feel like? But then look at, I think the key skills is not so much about how you write your prompt. It's actually much
Mm.
more about the critical thinking happening around it. And what I think see as one of the biggest dangers for HR professionals is there's a lot of HR tech now. So systems like Workday, success factors, everyone will recognize all these systems that are in there, big learning systems, etc. They've all rushed to put AI in there. Microsoft is a great example, actually. We're all using Microsoft, and Copilot is in most organizations now.
Mm.
If you don't understand what data is going into that and how it's pulling out certain information and suggesting how you would make decisions based on that information, that's a real danger. And so yeah, there's a part around not just, I think, governance on where do we source data, how do we use it, is it in a closed environment, etc., but particularly how you're then making decisions based on any data that comes out of these systems. And so I think that's an interesting skill set that we don't really have yet, and also is not the focus when we're rushing to implement AI. We're rushing more about being the engineering skills on, rather than, well, actually, it's more critical thinking, knowing data decisions,
Mm.
etc., etc. So yeah. Yeah,
And where it's pulling the data from, and
exactly.
and all those kinds of things. It's a two-sided
Exactly.
coin, isn't it? It's like, how effectively are people using AI, but then how effective is AI based on the data it's accessing as well.
Exactly. And we always talk about bad data in, bad data out, and so yeah, and it is problematic that we don't know what sits in the algorithm, and if that then sits in a system that processes human data in a workplace. I think there's some dangers there. Yeah.
So clearly, something on the agenda for CPOs to be looking at is in that AI space. What else would you say is your top items, knowing those kind of insights that CPOs should be thinking about right now?
Yeah, look, it relates back to those priorities, and I would say probably number one that keeps coming up is skills. So, and it's to shift, like, so most CPOs are helping their business transform in some ways, restructure, redesign, and it's
Mm.
all about scaling teams up and down at pace to go and solve a new problem, release a new product, take advantage of a new market. And generally, we're really, in general, we're seeing this shift from what you would consider jobs and functions to skills and roles, and the idea that if skill sets, people could have multiple roles. They might even be in several different teams, because it's about bringing the right skill set together to go and solve
Mm.
that problem or get that job done. But of course, sitting behind that sounds great, but that's, it's not as easy to execute, because how do you know the skills? Who has them? Where do you source them?
Yeah.
All those kind of things. So that's probably the big thing, is everyone's grappling with, how do I build a proper skills based approach to my workforce planning, and how do I do it at pace and at scale. And I use the T shape actually, and we can talk about that, but which comes from Agile, and I've kind of evolved it a bit to make it a bit more dynamic. But it really helps people understand this idea of being a specialist and a generalist at the same time. And so yeah,
Yeah.
so that's something we use a lot. And then the other one that's very specific to HR is this account manager concept of the business partner role, because what it reflects is, if we think of the employee experience as the product, it actually leads to a very different way of working in HR. It's much more multi-skilled, and it actually, for some organizations, we're now seeing new operating models come out for HR that are very similar to what you might be seeing in the business. So product-based, multi-skilled, much more about prioritizing business challenges to solve rather than just delivering a
Function.
certain remit or yeah. So, how do we solve the skills problem? Well, we'll need people from all over HR to do that. So what's the right mix of skills to go and solve that problem? So a lot of similar things that we're helping the organization achieve is playing out in HR. And I think that's
Mm.
something, I probably jumping ahead a little bit of some of the things you're going to ask me, but that's what HR is an interesting space, because we often reflect the organizations that we're working for, and of course, traditionally we've therefore reflected the more top-down hierarchical management structures that you've seen in organizations. But as organizations shift to more collaborative, networked, more these ecosystems, then good HR teams and professionals and leaders aim to understand that, emulate that, and then be able to enable that in the organization. So yeah, so I think those two are stand out for me. That's where I'm, yeah.
I love that term networked, and it certainly came through in some of the things that you were talking about there about that T shaped and being able to draw skills in to solve particular challenges as opposed to performing functions and tasks on a delivery plan. What
Yes.
else are you seeing in terms of modernizing HR, in terms of the shifts from traditional HR into what would be more fit for purpose in this 21st century?
Yeah. So, well, we, like other parts of the organization, are digitalizing, of course, and there's something about how do you create the great user experience internally of an organization just as much as externally for your customer.
Mm.
And traditionally, organizations are way behind internally, compared to what the tech you might be using at home, and particularly the tech you might be delivering to your customer. Um, so that kind of easy, user friendly, streamlined, user experience is just, yeah, it just often doesn't exist internally. So that's a big kind of focus, and that, of course, is bringing all the same skills or techniques and tools that you see in the business. So design thinking, customer experience, journey mapping, agile, prototyping and testing, because that's the best way to go and design and innovate in that space. So that's a big shift. And then the other one is this. So I think I know this exists in other professions, but I feel like HR have taken it to the extreme. So our whole profession has traditionally been based on these ideas of these topic specialisms. So, and it's even how you learn your craft, and you often do studies based on, someone does learning and development, another
Mm.
person does recruitment, another person does reward, another person does well-being, another person over here is employee experience. And we all create our own remits and our own deliverables, and particularly our own initiatives, and we go and load the organization up with all these different, now do this well-being thing, now go and do this with your benefits. And this is what I mean about that product concept. how does it all integrate together? What's the overall experience? Someone coming into the workplace on a day-to-day basis, they don't think that well-being is separate to getting paid. That's just part of their experience. And so it's really trying to help the profession move beyond these topic silos that we've always had, and start to actually work as a true, I suppose, collective, a strategic collective, solving business problems together. And what we're finding, of course, is as the world gets more complex, a business problem needs all these skills in it to get, the team needs all these skills to solve it. So, if you're wanting to build leaders of the future, or, solve the productivity crisis, build the right hybrid model, enrich the well-being of your people, that is so multi-layered. And there's so many problems that sit within that bigger issue, so you've got to be able to break it down, understand what to solve first, what to solve second. How do how would you realize value? How do you know you're solving these things? Even the skills one we've talked about. Skills means development, incentives, reward, how you talk about performance, how do you do team structures, there's lots of components in that. So I think it's definitely that shift to working in that much more multi-skilled, collective, strategic way, which, to be honest, I don't think we've traditionally been very good at. But anyway.
It's a hard change to make, isn't it? But I can see that there would be massive impacts in a positive way on employees instead of, in particular, leaders who generally are the recipients of all of these separate siloed initiatives coming down that they have to try and assimilate and put into practice in some shape or form. But if it was like, here's a challenge that we're solving and here's the ways that we're solving it, it would
Yeah.
certainly make some leaders' lives a lot easier.
I think so. And just being much more coherent, consistent,
Mm,
sustainable in your key messages and the outcomes that you're trying to develop. And it's also, and I know this is a big theme in other parts of the business, it's moving away from activity as value to impact and outcomes as value. So, in the past, we've been, we've been known to maybe measure how many people have done the training program, how
yeah.
many people have downloaded the form, how many people have filled in their performance management review as evidence of impact. But it's not, it's just evidence that people are doing certain things. And that
Mm.
could be good, that but you need to know, what is that behavior leading to. And so is it leading to greater retention of your key people? Is it leading to sense of career development? Is it leading to greater productivity? Is it leading to better business outcomes, better products for your customers? And so part of this is actually shifting in the profession to understanding how you track uh, initiatives end to end to realize those valuable outcomes. And I think there's a lot of crossover with how businesses are trying to do that with their products. There's if you look at product management, there's a big debate about, you can't just create things, ship it, and you've actually do
Hope for the best.
exactly, or just have these big lists of requirements and keep delivering against that. What is the problem you're solving for the customer?
Mm.
Why do they want your product? What are they going to do with it, and how do you start to build a whole experience around that? And so there's a lot of crossover of bringing that into HR now. And but like maybe other parts of the business, if you haven't worked that way, it's very different.
Mm.
And it's more commercial, I suppose, in how you go about what you do. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the profession, how we study our craft and how we, the professional bodies, even the universities, I think are a bit behind in helping HR professionals apply that kind of approach. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're still stuck a lot in policies and frameworks and things like that.
Still rolling out the same textbooks.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and and you go and spend all this time on labor relations, which is good, but you then need to make a real-time decision in the workplace. And what we're seeing now, you can go and pull on those information, you can go and speak to a lawyer at that time, you can go, you know what I mean? So it's actually knowing how
Yeah.
to navigate a business scenario, rather than just know labor law. I think there needs to be a real shift in how we build our profession, yeah, to
Yeah.
help with that, yeah.
This concept you're talking about being able to be more data driven as well, in terms of actual measuring, being clear about the outcomes and then measuring those outcomes. And that's something that, to your point, lots of other departments are still, struggling and learning how to do better, whether they use OKRs or whether they have the data in the right places or whether they can be able to, pull things together to get in, and turn them into insights and then apply that. So it seems to me that, one of the things that HR departments will need to really be cognizant of is allowing for capacity to do that work and also invest in the data and getting clean data and being able to be clear about our data sources and how they could leverage tech to be able to support that.
Yeah, definitely. But also not over engineer that, because what you
Mm,
see is teams then go, oh, okay, we've got to do a big data project to get to the point that we want to be with our analytics, where you've got to be able to move forward while building the capability. So I'm a big believer of going and choosing, a key business problem to solve. So it might be, helping a team understand what are the right skills to develop or buy or borrow for AI to be to be part of their product offering or something like that. So that's a key one at the moment. Or how do you upskill a team to go and actually, automate part of the business process, and have a new approach around doing that. So go and choose a real business problem, and then use that as the case study of, okay, what data do we need? How would we do we already have it? Because there's a big thing of people go, oh, we don't have the data. Well, it's actually more about using the data to inform certain decisions or findings to help
mhm.
how to act. So yeah, so I think there's a piece around that, and then you can start to think about, all right, well, how would we then, so the model for this case study, how would we then scale that? How would we, what data do we need to be collecting? How does it get cleaned, before it goes in, or what's the kind of process around it? But also, I think, um, being aware that you can't, we often don't have the skill set in HR to do that. So we need to think about how we build and buy and, borrow the right skill set as well. And this is where I'm a big believer of having people in your HR team that come from other parts of the business.
Mm.
So go and work with the data scientist that's already in the business. Go and work with the analytics team that might be working with the product. Um, Look at the, partnering with your tech team more closely. We don't always have to bring these skills into our own function from the outset, and because so I think it's also thinking beyond how you do it with just within the HR team. Yeah.
Great. Just coming back to some of those global aspects, if we look at companies across, you've worked with not for profit and you've worked with global banks in different industries. Is there any common challenges that we haven't sort of covered already that apply to all of these areas, or is there specific challenges in some sectors that people will need to lean more into in some areas?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So the not-for-profit one is an interesting one, because I work with quite a number of large charities and you know uh, kind of organizations, community organizations. So in the UK, we've worked with people like Citizens Advice, which is where you go if you need help on legal, finance, etc. So we've also worked with Macmillan Cancer Research, which is a really big charity over here, and some other really big ones like MenCap, which is for disability, and some others. The Guide Dogs is a recent organization we're working a lot with. And what so what's interesting is that agility or business agility is really key because they're needing to understand how do you deliver value at pace and how do they
Yeah.
move away from that much more, I suppose, waterfall approach and how they deliver projects, how do they deliver initiatives, how do they build funding models. But it's not about profit per se, it's about value and purpose. So it's a really interesting one, but one of the key things is there. I think one of the main trends is that the world is increasingly complex, not sure if you've noticed, very uncertain, and and so when we talk about agility now, this is very much about how do you navigate and be more resilient, or even anti-fragile, which is a term, this idea of finding opportunities in these times of crisis, just as much as using certain frameworks to deliver great products. So there's sort of but what's interesting is that environment has caused lots of problems for businesses, profit businesses, but for not for profit, your whole funding kind of process is disrupted. So
Mm.
people don't donate like they used to. It needs to be digital. So you don't, stand at the supermarket with your bucket anymore. The way that governments give aid is radically changing or disappearing. And the way that you connect with society, the way you solve problems needs to be much more systems based. And again, thinking about the big problems to solve rather than just going out and delivering small individual initiatives. So all these themes I think we talk about in the business space, they're playing out in the not for profit, but with a slightly
Mhm.
different twist. And so this idea of understanding value, understanding how you iterate, understanding how you test and prototype before you release are so essential, because you don't have any money to spare. You've really got to make sure it goes the long way, and you have to manage risk. And so what you're seeing in that space is this whole, it used to be that a more waterfall approach was considered more in control and less risky, which we now know in this world is not true. It's actually
More.
increases the risk. So
Yeah.
there's this shift of, we've actually got to work in a more agile way to manage the risk and be more dynamic in how we get funding. And I just find that fascinating, because you know, it's the same concept but playing out in this different kind of way. And I'm sure if people think about it, they probably can recognize it in government. They could recognize it in definitely a lot of government agencies or aid agencies that might be working, and they're all in crisis. And how do they now re-engineer how they get money in and then deliver it to the right place? Yeah. So
And ensure there's that value for those who have
exactly.
donated or ratepayers, for example.
Totally. How do you demonstrate, that that Macmillan Cancer Research is making a difference on the ground, not just with, helping people deal with their own sort of treatment and process, but how do they actually change the outcomes, of either the research or the amount of cures or, good treatment, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Accessibility, reduction of wait lists,
Accessibility,
those sorts of
exactly.
things.
And if
Mm.
and then you've got to kind of partner with either the local health system or different community groups. And yeah, so it's fascinating, and extremely complex. This is the thing, it's not straightforward. Yeah. Mm.
And as organizations grow in complexity, then the demands on HR obviously increase as well.
Yeah, yeah. Like, it's really interesting working with those groups, because the internal HR teams are so much a part of that transformation. So I was speaking to someone from Macmillan yesterday, and their big topic was their they're needing to upskill this whole new part of the organization to go out and analyze systemic issues. So they're trying to
Mm.
work with what's in the UK is the NHS. So that's the big, it's the medical system. So how do they go and partner with NHS to work out apply a systems thinking approach to the problem that's happening around people accessing treatment. So a big one was apparently if you have diabetes and you have cancer, they're very separate processes and they don't talk to each other. And so where there's a lot of crosses, so things like that, so apply, so a lot of what we talk a lot about in Agile, systems thinking, complexity theory. I just find it so fascinating that they're needing to apply all this in that real world situation. And so HR is a huge part of some of these people development strategies on transformation strategies that are sitting behind these organizations. Yeah.
And obviously, the HR department is always, at the end of having to respond to change. So if you stand up a new area or you stand up a new skill set or you need to pivot over here, then obviously it's the great enabler of all of those things. So being able to move rapidly and with resilience is so key. And I know your book, Agile HR, you've got two books actually, Agile HR and Agile L&D, if I remember correctly,
Mm-hmm.
over there.
Yep, behind me there.
Fabulous. And so tell us a little bit for those listening around, in your book, you talk about agile for HR and agile HR, like two sides of a
Mm-hmm.
coin. Let's talk
Mm-hmm.
about that for a little bit, about what does that mean?
Yeah, sure. So, well, it goes back to a little bit of what I was saying before, where there's a whole piece around HR teams or people teams um, taking on some of the concepts of agility and particularly some of the tools to help them get better results. So this is, to work at pace. How do you ruthlessly prioritize what to focus on? How do you know the value that you're going after? What are you solving for? And how do you rapidly test and validate that you're moving towards solving that problem before you release the solution big bang? And let's be honest, we've all been part of a big bang, a one size fits all HR project where this massive new system comes out and says, oh, you're all going to do performance differently, or you're all going to use this system for your learning. And it can be a massive fail because it doesn't suit anyone because they've gone for the one size fits all, and it overcomplicates the scenario. So,
Yeah.
so trying to shift away from that, and so there's a huge benefit in taking a lot of those tools and particularly the mindset around, agility is about solving complex problems. So how do you take that into the world of HR, like we've just talked about, and solve some of these big issues in organizations? But then HR plays this very interesting role where we need to enable, transformation, change, and therefore agility in the wider organization. And, I think if we think about 10 years ago or a bit like when agile first really started to make the big impact on organizations, and even a bit before that, but particularly once it started to move out of technology and into the wider part of the organization, HR was seen as the enemy, because we represented the processes and these, internal processes and policies that often got in the way of agility. So even things like individual reward and performance versus collective, outcomes and measurements, and insisting on feedback forms to be filled in, when actually agile, the whole concept is driving this feedback loop in how you work and how you get,
Yeah.
improve what you do. So part of this is that for HR to enable business agility, they have to help redesign a lot of the people practices that exist. And I think I'm a big believer that you can't do that unless you understand it yourself. And this is also what you saw,
Yeah.
particularly 10 years ago, were HR teams redesigning systems and processes in organizations under the idea of enabling agility, but not understanding it and not doing it themselves. And again, often over engineering it or bringing, anything that you do has to be it has to be in the flow of work. It has to enable work. It has to be, part of getting work done. So if any process you introduce that adds to that it's an add-on. It's a kind of, oh, I've got to do it. Everyone talks about all these things I've got to do on top of my day job. You
Yeah.
need to be linking to the flow of work as much as possible. And so, yeah, so all kinds of things such as, helping teams work effectively together, building learning that people can kind of own themselves, and rather than it being mandatory training that they go to on certain topics. How do people act, how do you make things much more dynamic in an organization, and then how do you allow people to move around based on skills and job in
Mhm.
problems and needs, rather than oh, okay, I've got to apply for this job and it's going to take 6 months and I've got to have these qualifications, or I had to have spent this amount of time in a similar job. It's very outdated to what we're trying to do in organizations now. So, but I think you can't appreciate all of that unless you know agility yourself. So yeah, so that's what I mean by agile for HR and HR for agile. Yeah.
Do you have any, case studies or examples where teams have had some good successes from trying those agile ways of working?
Yeah. So I think part of it is understanding the problem to solve. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So one is a team that were running big 2-day management development programs across a very large organization, tens of thousands of people. And they not only found that they could only ever get so many hundred of people through these trainings each year, but often it would come down to, well, what are you going to do differently, as a result of these 2 days? And everyone said they really needed to develop their managerial skills, but never had time to attend. So it was this constant kind of battle to make these
Mm.
things happen. And then it was very hard beyond activity of people attending these programs to really show what was the result. And so they were quite extreme, and they just stopped it and said, this is not working. We're going to stop all management development training, which caused a big stir. And then they went, okay, we need to go and spend time with the personas of the different
Mm.
personas, with the managers, and find out what is happening on the ground. And what they discovered is that managers talked about everyday problems that they had to solve. So I've got to hire someone for my team, I need to do it quickly, but I really want this person to fit well. I want it to be the right, kind of skill set, and I'm unsure about how to go about it. We might go, oh, you need to go off on recruitment training and this and this, but no, that's much more about that contextual situation. So,
Mhm.
and then there was I've got to have this difficult conversation tomorrow, and I'm really struggling. I don't want to lose this person, but they've got to hear this feedback. So how do I do that? So what they realized is they needed to start focusing on these problems to solve and actually start using the language that the managers used when they recognized that they had this problem. And so what they started to do was design, problem by problem, so like user need by user need, um, and prototype and test different solutions. What if the manager could watch a video? What if they could talk to a coach? What if there was a 90-minute session that they could attend in a fairly, quick turnaround? What if they could read things, And so they started to basically create what actually ended up being this sort of primarily digital ecosystem that managers could tap into based on the learning need that they had. And then they even started to realize, well, actually, some of these learning needs come up when there's processes, such as performance conversations, such as, so then they started to test, well, what happens if we link some of these learning solutions to key messages that are going out or actions that people have to do and things like this. So, and what happened is over time, they built a whole new way of doing management development. But they didn't start with that. And that's what you see a lot of HR teams do. They go, oh, we're going to redesign management development. We're going to build an ecosystem of learning.
Mhm.
That's great, but how do you go about it, and how do you? So this was, human centric design. Start with the need, start with the user experience, list out the different things to solve for, then test and validate at that problem what works. And what was interesting is they made some rules around everything that they created had to have some kind of digital component so they could track it. So, how many people were accessing this, how many people were watching this. And then they started to track the outcomes of either conversations or what the teams were working on, or customer outcomes, productivity rates. And so they were tracking what I call lead indicators. We are seeing the behaviors that we need to see to lead to these valuable outcomes. And then their value was that they could show that most managers were now engaging in learning compared to just the couple of hundred per year. They were tracking engagement, and direct feedback, but they were then tracking the outcomes of those managers with their team. So were they hiring faster? Were they retaining key people? Did they see the kind of productivity outcomes that they wanted to see? So you then had this whole ecosystem of how to measure it as well. So I think that's a good example of, that's very similar to how we might go about building a product for a customer, and that iteration and building it up over time based on data and what you're seeing. So yeah, so that's probably a good example. Yeah.
Great example. And that idea of starting, because you could get lulled
Mm.
into, let's design it and we'll take, 6 months and go to various forums and get feedback and then iterate the
Yes.
design again and again. But it sounds like, let's start, focus on a problem, solve that problem, learn from it, and then rinse and repeat and build over time.
Exactly. Yeah. And that team also did one where, which I think is in one of the ones that I take people through in the L&D book, but because it's a really nice way of, so some people really struggle in HR at how do you test before you release, when it's going to be something that's a big, like a program or something. And this team showed that, so the issue was career development, and they were losing people after sort of 2 years because there was evidence that people thought it was easier to go and find a job elsewhere than to find the job internally, because it was often quite a hard thing to do.
Mm.
And they went and did again some design thinking. Okay, what's the problem to solve? What's going on for key groups of people? Um, and they found that there was a list of problems, but one of them was that actually there is loads of career opportunities in this organization. They're just not visible. People don't know how to apply for them. Managers don't know how to support people getting the next job. So they had this great idea, which was, this like recruitment marketplace, where people could, have their like LinkedIn profiles on there. They get recommended roles and they all get connected. It all sounds great, but how would you really even go about that? And so they actually tested it on cardboard first. So they had these like controlled test sessions where they literally had, this is the email you get in your inbox, this is the landing page, what would you do next? And people were even tapping on the cardboard. And what they established from that was, yes, people were willing to link their LinkedIn profile, but only under these kind of circumstances, and actually only in these areas. So they already were working out that you couldn't just go and make this for everybody in the organization. And so then they did then they found a vendor supplier, but they were very specific. They were only going to run it for key teams for a set period of time. So it was a true, prototype and test with this key piece of tech. And they ran a very controlled experiment where it was, okay, we're going to have certain groups of people. It needs to have certain diversity in the group. Are women more or less likely to apply, and what happens for them? And what was really interesting in that second round is they found that there was this whole part of the organization that couldn't access this kind of tech. It just wasn't going to work for them. And yeah, so it was just, and so each stage of developing this solution was clarifying, will this fix the problem, and are we seeing the right behaviors that
Mm.
leads to the value outcomes? And then the value outcomes were, how do we see evidence of retention after 2 years? Do we see evidence of career move, internal moves? Have they gone up? But also, what happened to the ones that they applied for roles but they didn't get them? What's going on for that percentage of people? And yeah, so that's, I just think that's a really another good example of this iterative way of developing solutions where you're delivering value every step of the way,
Mm.
and you're learning about what's going on for your organization and your people, and what you're solving for. Yeah.
in both of those examples, those shorter iterations, obviously you've got the power of learning every time, but also you're increasing the relevance. You can increase the amount of people that you can reach sooner than what you could before. So you're reducing all those time lags and all the time delays and all the wastes. And then obviously you're just getting lots of great data and insights to make better informed decisions for the next step that you're going to make.
Totally, exactly. And I think that's the thing is, so I talk a lot about this lead and lag indicators, because a lot of people initiatives are, we're going to, engagement. So we're going to, lift engagement. We're going to enrich well-being. We're going to, so they're these really big outcomes, and they're hard to track. They also take a long time to influence. So, to change the engagement of an organization, it's going to take 3 months, 6 months, even to change retention, is often, it's not an immediate thing. And some of it is that you have to change behaviors and ways of working to then get to your result. So you need ways that you can track activity, behavior, user data, on that, you're seeing the right indicators that are going to lead to these outcomes that you're going after. So that's actually another thing I'd spend a lot of time now with CPOs and their teams, is using things like OKRs and other measurements of how do they get much better at articulating value, and how they get much better at using key results to be the ones that are showing those indicators towards that lag indicator, and so you don't just see these results of, we will lift engagement by 10% next week, kind of thing. Like, what does that mean? Yeah. So yeah.
For people on the listening to the episode, they obviously might not be able to reach you direct for a phone call to tackle some of the challenges that they might be facing. Let's talk about your book for a little bit, Agile HR, and obviously your Agile L&D. Do you want to just give a quick synopsis of what people can find in those books for those looking to go, well, I'm not sure that, Agile would work for us, in this area. How do I find out more?
Yeah, sure. Well, the Agile L&D, even though it says L&D, is actually for everyone in the people space, and it is an update of my thinking, and so it's got the most recent case studies in there, and that one actually breaks it into 5 components. One of being product led, that we've talked about, working in multi-skilled teams. I call it T-shaped people and T-shaped teams, delivering impact, experimentation. So it's about, and human centric design. So it actually comes at it a bit differently and helps people teams understand what are the core components, and then how do you go and apply them to build these kind of solutions. And I did it because, one, learning and development is a kind of space in itself, and it's often the first area that goes agile in HR, but also can actually even sit within the business. It doesn't necessarily sit in HR. So it's sort of, and it's an industry, it's a huge industry of, lots of solutions and tech. And but also, some of the biggest challenges that organizations face sit in what I call the OD, organizational development and learning space. So the skills, challenge, bringing in AI, all that transformation pieces and cultural change sits in that space. So that's kind of trying to help people see how they apply these approaches to solve those big problems, but also how you actually bring it into those teams and those areas. So I think it's actually probably, it's a great place to start. It's very accessible, and as you said, like I get feedback that it's very practical, and as you said, very business orientated. So I think that's why people like it. And then Agile HR was the first one. I co-wrote that with a colleague at the time, and we wanted a toolkit we wanted the toolkit that we didn't have. So I'm known as one of the first people to do this, and it was a bit, you'd kind of just, there was no reference that you could go
No
to.
guiding
I
lights. Yeah.
know. And also, all the references were really tech orientated, and while we're not saying that we're doing anything different, we're just taking everything that started in that tech space and bringing into HR and other parts of the business. You have to translate, and you have to so what some people said. They said, "Oh, what we really like about it is that just puts it into everyday business language, and also it gives me all these HR examples of how you apply it. And so that first book is about what we talked about. What does it mean to go and bring agile into HR, and a bit of a step by step, and then what does it mean to go and enable business agility in the organization. And in particular, that one looks at even how do you build agile transformation. What are scaling models, what do they mean? How do you make decisions around that? How do you build a transformation team that then goes and delivers agile in transformation in an agile way? This kind of, how do you do measurements, how do you do OKRs, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, so they come from two slightly different perspectives.
Fantastic resources for anyone wanting to be able to sit down and be able to reflect, but lots of case studies to be able to go, I can see how that works
Yeah.
because there's a story about an area that I'm working with that I can understand.
Yeah, I like to think that, and like they're both written in a way that you can just jump in and out of different chapters based on what you need. Okay, I'm going to run an experiment. Okay, right, I'm going to get the L&D, agile L&D out, and I'm going to go through the experiment section, and I'm going to know how to write a hypothesis, know how to test it, know how to set it up in a more scientific way. So it's lovely. I've had, at conferences, people turn up with the book and they've got post-it notes and different, and so it's really nice to know that people use it in that way, in that very practical way. Yeah.
It's always a good sign when a book has a lot of post-it notes. That's it.
Totally. I know.
It's a
It
sign
makes my
of
day.
value. Now, where can people find more of you?
Well, I have this name that seems to be quite unique, Natal Dank. I'm the only one on LinkedIn, so you can always find me there, and I'm always happy to connect. You can contact me directly for speaking and expert kind of views, but I also then do have this other hat where I'm executive director at PXO Culture. So you can just go to pxoculture.com, and you can find where we do, and we specialize in workplace transformation. So it's helping organizations, and particularly helping HR leaders and teams lead these kind of transformations, both within their own function as well as across the organization. So just come and find us there. There's loads of tools on the PXO Culture website, by the way. So we do lots of events. There's one coming up very soon, actually.
Fabulous. We'll put the link in the description, actually. So we'll get the link from you. Thank you so much for joining us today and introducing us to the concept as well of employee experience account manager, and being able to be that connective tissue between what customers need and what we have and what we might need next. So some fantastic insights. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.